An account of the aboriginal inhabitants of the Californian Peninsula. Introduction. When, in 1767, by a decree of Charles Roman III, all members of the Order of the Jesuits were banished from Spain and the transatlantic provinces subject to that realm, those Jesuits, who superintended the missions established by the Spaniards since 1697 in Lower California, were compelled to leave their Indian converts, and to transfer their spiritual authority to a number of friars of the Franciscan order. One of the banished Jesuits, a German, who had spent 17 years in the Californian Peninsula, published, after his return to his native country, a book which contains a description of that remote part of the American continent, and gives also quite a detailed account of its aboriginal inhabitants, with whom the author had become thoroughly acquainted during the many years devoted to their conversion to Christianity. This book, which is now very scarce in Germany, and, of course, still more so in this country, bears the title, Account of the American Peninsula of California, with a twofold appendix of false reports. Written by a priest of the Society of Jesus, who lived there many years past. Published with the permission of my superiors. Mannheim, 1773. Modesty, or perhaps other motives, induced the author to remain anonymous, but with little success, for his name, which was Jakob Baegert, is sometimes met with in old catalogues, in connection with the title of his book. That his home was on the Upper Rhine he states himself in the text, but further particulars relative to his private affairs, before or after his missionary labors in California, have not come to my knowledge. He does not even mention over which of the 15 missions existing at his time on the peninsula he presided, but merely says that Poe had lived in California under the 25th degree, and 12 leagues distant from the Pacific coast, opposite the little bay of St. Magdalen. On the map accompanying his work there are 2 missionary stations marked under that latitude, the mission of St. Aloysius and that of the $7, Septum Dolorum, of which the first named evidently was his place of residence. The work in question constitutes a small octavo volume of 358 pages, and is divided into 3 parts. The first division, of which I will give a short synopsis in this introduction, treats of the topography, physical geography, geology, and natural history of the peninsula. The second part gives an account of the inhabitants, and the third embraces a short but interesting history of the missions in Lower California. In the appendices to the work the author refutes certain exaggerated reports that had been published concerning the Californian Peninsula, and he is particularly very severe upon Venegas' Noticia de la California. Madrid, 1757, 3 vols, a work which is also translated into the English, French, and German languages. He accuses the Spanish author of having given by far too favorable, and, in many instances, utterly false accounts of the country, its productions, and inhabitants, which is rather a noticeable circumstance, since Venegas is considered as an authority in matters relating to the ethnology of California. While reading the work of the German missionary, I was struck with the amount of ethnological information contained in it, especially in the second part, which is exclusively devoted to the aboriginal inhabitants, as stated before, and upon conversing on the subject with some friends, members of the American Ethnological Society, they advised me to translate for publication, if not the whole book, at least that part of it, which relates to the native population, of which we know, comparatively, perhaps less than of any other portion of the indigenous race of North America, as there is a growing taste for the study of ethnology manifested in this country, and, consequently, a tendency prevailing to collect all materials illustrating the former condition of the American Aborigines in different parts of the continent. I complied with the request of my friends, and devoted my hours of leisure to the preparation of this little work, supposing that the account of a man who lived among those Californians a century ago, when their original state had been but little changed by intercourse with Europeans, might be an acceptable addition to our stock of ethnological knowledge. I have to state, however, that the following pages are not a translation in the strict sense of the word, but a reproduction of the work only as facts as it refers to ethnological matters. The reasons which induced me thus to deviate from the usual course of a translator are obvious, for even that portion of the text which treats of the native race contains many things that are not in the least connected with ethnology, the good father being somewhat garrulous, and rather fond of moralizing and enlarging upon religious matters, as might be expected from one of his calling, and, although he places the natives on the peninsula exceedingly low in the scale of human development, he takes, nevertheless, occasion to draw comparisons between their barbaric simplicity and the over-refined habits of the Europeans, much in the manner of Tacitus, who seizes upon every opportunity to rebuke the luxury and extravagance of his countrymen, while he describes the rude sylvan life of the ancient inhabitants of Germany. My object being simply to rescue from oblivion a number of facts relating to a portion of the American race, I have omitted all superfluous commentaries indulged in by the author, and, in order to bring kindred subjects under common heads, I have now and then used some freedom in the arrangement of the matter, which is not always properly linked in the original. Although the second part of the book has chiefly furnished the material for this reproduction, I have transferred to the English text, and inserted in the proper places, all those passages in the other divisions, and even in the two appendices that have a bearing upon ethnology, giving thus unity and completeness to the subject, which induced me to prepare these pages. For the rest I have preserved, so far as feasible, the language of the author. Not much can be said, however, in favor of the style exhibited in the original, and even the spelling of the words defies all rules of orthography, which were adopted a century ago in the German language, nor is our father unaware of his deficiencies, but honestly states in his preface that, if his style was none of the smoothest, and his orthography incorrect in some places, the reader might configure that during the 17 years of his sojourn in California, comprising the period from 1751 to 1768, he hardly ever had conversed in German, and, consequently, almost forgotten the use of his mother language. Of the peninsula Father Baegert gives a rather woeful account. He describes that region as an arid, mountainous country, covered with rocks and sand, deficient in water, and almost without shade trees, but abounding in thorny plants and shrubs of various kinds. The sterility of the soil is caused by the scantiness of water. No one, says the author, need be afraid to drown himself in water, but the danger of dying from thirst is much greater. There falls some rain, accompanied by short thunderstorms, during the months of July, August, September, and October, filling the channels worn in the hard ground. Some of these soon become dry after the showers. Others, however, hold water during the whole year, and on these and the stagnant water collected in pools and ponds men and beasts have to rely for drink. Of running waters, deserving the name of brooks, there are but 6 in the country, and of these 6 only 4 reach the sea, while the others lose themselves not very far from their sources among rocks and sand. There is nothing to be seen in Lower California that may be called a wood, only a few straggling oaks, pines, and some other kinds of trees unknown in Europe, are met with, and these are confined to certain localities. Shade and material for the carpenter are, therefore, very scarce. The only tree of any consequence is the so-called mesquite, but besides that it always grows quite isolated, and never in groups. The trunk is very low, or the wood so hard that it almost defies the application of iron tools. The author mentions, further, a kind of low Brazil wood, a tree called palo blanco, the bark of which serves for tanning, the palo hero or iron wood, which is still harder than the mesquite, wild fig trees that bear no fruit, wild willows and barren palms, all of which would be ashamed to appear beside a European oak or nut tree. One little tree yields an odoriferous gum that was used in the Californian churches as frankincense. But in compensation for the absence of large trees, there is a prodigious abundance of prickly plants, some of a gigantic height, but of little practical use, their soft, spongy stems soon rotting after being cut. Among the indigenous edible productions of the vegetable kingdom are chiefly mentioned the tunas, or Indian figs, the aloe, and the pitahayas, of which the latter deserve a special notice as forming an important article of food of the Indians. There are 2 kinds of this fruit, the sweet and the sour pitahaya. The former is round, as large as a hen's egg, and has a green, thick, prickly shell that covers a red or white flesh, in which the black seeds are scattered like grains of powder. It is described as being sweet, but not of a very agreeable taste without the addition of lemon juice and sugar. There is no scarcity of shrubs bearing this fruit, and from some it can be gathered by hundreds. They become mature in the middle of June, and continue for more than 8 weeks. The sour pitahaya, which grows on low, creeping bushes, bristling with long spines, is much larger than the other kind, of excellent taste, but by far less abundant. For, although the shrubs are very plentiful, there is hardly one among 100 that bears fruit. Of the aloe, or mescal, as the Spaniards and Mexicans call it, the fibers are used by the aborigines, in lieu of hemp, for making threads and strings, and its fruit is eaten by them. A very curious portion of the book is that which treats of the animals found in California. The author is evidently not much of a naturalist, and, in classifying animals, he manifests occasionally a sovereign independence that would shock the feelings of a Blumenbach or Agassiz, yet his remarks, resulting from actual observation, are for the most part correct, and evince undeniably his love of truth. In the list of wild quadrupeds are enumerated the deer, hare, rabbit, fox, coyote, wild cat, skunk, zorillo, leopard, American panther, onza, and wild ram. In reference to the last named animal, the author remarks, where the chain of mountains that runs lengthwise through the whole peninsula reaches a considerable height, there are found animals resembling our rams in all respects, except the horns, which are thicker, longer, and much more curved. When pursued, these animals will drop themselves from the highest precipices upon their horns without receiving any injury. Their number, however, cannot be great, for I never saw a living specimen, nor the fur of one in the possession of an Indian, but many skins of leopards and onzas. This animal is doubtless identical with the Rocky Mountain sheep, Ovis montana. The feathered tribe does not seem to be very plentiful in California, since, according to Father Baegert, a person may travel 1 or 2 days without seeing other birds, but occasionally a filthy vulture, raven, or bat. Among the few which he observed are the redbird, cardinal bluebird, hummingbird, and an ash-colored bird with a tail resembling that of a peacock, and a beautiful tuft on its head, also wild ducks, and a species of swallow, the latter appearing only now and then in small numbers, and therefore considered as extraneous. There are some small fish found in the waters of California, but they do not amount to much, and during Lent the father obtained his supply from the Pacific, distant 12 leagues from his habitation. On the other days of abstinence his meal usually consisted of a little goat milk and dry beans, and if a few eggs were added, he cared for nothing else, but considered himself well entertained. Under the comprehensive, but not very scientific head of vermin, the author enumerates snakes, scorpions, centipedes, huge spiders, toads, wasps, bats, ants, and grasshoppers. These vermin seem to have been a great annoyance to the good missionary, especially the snakes, of which there are about 20 different kinds in California, the rattlesnake being, of course, the most conspicuous among them. This dangerous reptile, which seems to be very numerous in that region, is minutely and correctly described, and, as might be expected, there are also some snake stories related. One day when the author was about to shave and took his razors from the upper board of his bookshelf, he discovered there, to his horror, a rattlesnake of large size. He received likewise in his new dwelling house, which was a stone building, frequent visits from scorpions, large centipedes, tarantulas, ants and toads, ale precautions being unavailing against the intrusion of these uninvited guests. The grasshoppers are represented as a real public calamity. Migrating from the southern part of the peninsula towards the north, they deluge the country, obscuring the sun by their numbers, and causing a noise that resembles a strong wind. Never deviating from their line of march, they will climb houses and churches encountered during their progress, laying waste all fields and gardens over which their pernicious train passes. Of the climate in California the author speaks well, and considers it as both healthy and agreeable. Being only 1.5 degrees distant from the Tropic of Cancer, he lived, of course, in a hot region, and he remarks with reference to the high temperature that some thought the name California was a contraction from the Latin words calidofornax, hot oven, without vouching, however, for the correctness of the derivation, though he is certain that the appellation is not of Indian origin. The greatest heat begins in the month of July and lasts till the middle of October, but there is every day in the year quite a refreshing wind blowing, which begins at noon, if not sooner, and continues till night. The principal winds are northwest and southwest. The north wind blows only now and then during the winter months, but the east wind hardly ever, the latter circumstance being somewhat surprising to the author, who observed that the clouds are almost invariably moving from the east. He never found the cold severer than during the latter part of September or April on the banks of the Rhine where, after his return, the persevering coldness of winter and clouded atmosphere during that period made him long for the mild temperature and always blue and serene sky of the country he had left. Fogs in the morning are frequent in California, and occur not only during fall and winter, but also sometimes in the hot season. Dew is said to be not more frequent nor heavier than in Middle Europe. Though the author represents California as a dry, sterile country, where but little rain falls, he admits that in those isolated parts, where the proximity of water imparts humidity, the soil exhibits an astonishing fertility. There, he says, One may plant what he chooses, and it will thrive where the earth yields fruit 100-fold, as in the best countries of Europe, producing wheat and maize, rice, pumpkins, water and other melons of 20 pounds weight, cotton, lemons, oranges, plantains, pomegranates, excellent sweet grapes, olives and figs, of which the latter can be gathered twice in a summer. The same field yields a double or threefold harvest of maize, that grows to prodigious height, and bears sometimes 12 ears on one stalk. I have seen vines in California that produced in the second year a medium-sized basket full of grapes. In the third or fourth year some are as thick as an arm, and shoot forth, in one season, 8 and more branches of 6 feet length. It is only to be regretted that such humid places are of very rare occurrence, and that water for irrigating a certain piece of land sometimes cannot be found within a distance of 60 leagues. In the last chapter of the first part, the author gives an account of the pearl fisheries and silver mines carried on in Lower California while he was there. Both kinds of enterprise are represented as insignificant and by no means very profitable. Every summer, he says, 8, 10 or 12 poor Spaniards from Sonora, Sinaloa or other parts opposite the peninsula, cross the Gulf in little boats, and encamp on the California shore for the purpose of obtaining pearls. They carry with them a supply of Indian corn and some hundredweight of dried beef, and are accompanied by a number of Mexican Indians, who serve as pearl fishers, for the Californians themselves have hitherto shown no inclination to risk their lives for a few yards of cloth. The pearl fishers are let down into the sea by ropes, being provided with a bag for receiving the pearl oysters, which they rake from the rocks and the bottom, and when they can no longer hold their breath, they are pulled up again with their treasure. The oysters, without being opened, are counted, and every 5th one is put aside for the king. Most of them are empty, some contain black, others white pearls, the latter being usually small and ill-shaped. If a Spaniard, after 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor, and after deducting all expenses, has gained 100 American pesos, that is 500 French livres, or a little more than 200 Rhenish florins, a very small sum in America, he thinks he has made a little fortune which he cannot realize every season. God knows whether the 5th part of the pearls fished in the Californian sea yields, on an average, to the Catholic king 100 or 200 pesos in a year, even if no frauds are committed in the transaction. I heard of only 2 individuals, with whom I was also personally acquainted, who had accumulated some wealth, after spending 20 and more years in that line of business. The others remained poor wretches, with all their pearl fishing. There were but 2 silver mines of any note in operation at the time of Baegert's sojourn in California, and those had been opened only a few years previous to his arrival. They were situated in the districts of Santana and San Antonio, near the southern end of the peninsula, and only 3 leagues distant from each other. Digging for silver in California is not represented as a lucrative business, the owner of one of the mines being so poor that he had to beg for his traveling money when he was about to return to Spain. The proprietor of the other mine was in better circumstances, but he owed his wealth more to other speculations than to his subterranean pursuits. The mining population in the 2 districts amounted to 400 souls, women and children included, and the workmen were either Spaniards born in America, or Indians from the other side of the Californian Gulf. The external condition of these people is represented as wretched in the highest degree. The soil produced almost nothing, and not having the necessary money to procure provisions from the Mexican side, they were sometimes compelled to gather their food in the fields, like the native Californians. The author speaks of a locality between the 28th and 29th degree, called Rosario, where some supposed gold to exist, but even admitting the fact, he thinks it would be almost impossible to work mines in that region, where neither food for men and beasts, nor water and wood, can be procured. Near the mission of St. Ignatius, 28th degree, sulfur is found, and on the islands of El Carmen and St. Joseph in the Californian Gulf, and in different places on both coasts salt of very good quality is abundant. Having thus given an abstract of the first part of the book, I cannot conclude these introductory remarks without saying a few words in favor of the Jesuits. Whatever we may think, as Protestants, of the tendencies of that order, we cannot but admit that those of its members, who came as missionaries to America, deserve great credit for their zeal in propagating a knowledge of the countries and nations they visited in the New World. I allow the student of American ethnology particularly, the numerous writings of the Jesuit fathers are of inestimable value, forming, as it were, the very foundations upon which almost all subsequent researches in that interesting field of inquiry are based. The missionaries and discoverers whom the order of the Jesuits sent forth were for the most part not only possessed of the courage of martyrs, and of statesmanlike qualities, but likewise of great knowledge and learning. They were enthusiastic travelers, naturalists, and geographers. They were the best mathematicians and astronomers of their time. They have been the first to give us faithful and circumstantial accounts of the new countries and nations they visited. There are few districts in the interior of America concerning which the Jesuits have not supplied us with the oldest and best works, and we can scarcely attempt the study of any American language without meeting with a grammar composed by a Jesuit. In addition to their chapels and colleges in the wilderness, the Jesuits likewise erected observatories, and there are few rivers, lakes, and mountains in the interior, which they have not been the first to draw upon our maps. With this well-deserved eulogy, which is quoted from Mr. J.G.R. Cole's recent work on the discovery of America, I leave to Father Baegert himself the task of relating his experiences among the natives of Lower California. An account of the aboriginal inhabitants of the Californian Peninsula, as given by Jakob Baegert, a German Jesuit missionary, who lived there 17 years during the second half of the last century. Translated and arranged by Charles Rowe. An account of the aboriginal inhabitants of the Californian Peninsula.